Douglas. It's great to be here. I've had a chance to speak at the law school here over a number of years, and it's a great pleasure to be with all of you. And I hope we have a good chance for questions and answers before I know a number of you have to run off at 1:30, and I won't take your departure personally at all. I'll remember what you look like, but otherwise I'll hold it against you. This talk really comes from someone asking me a question a few months ago, and that is to say, you know, you're off in Myanmar, and you're working on the refugee crisis, and at the same time you're also doing a lot of work with First Nations in Canada, and you know you're still reasonably politically active. You know what keeps this all together? Like what are you actually doing? How do you go from doing one thing over the way, halfway around the world, and then dealing with issues of Indigenous and Aboriginal rights here at home? And this has prompted me to begin writing a book which is called Truth and Consequences. And the theme of the book is quite simply that we need to become more aware of the threats that our democracies face around the world from forces of nationalism and populism, and that the rise of these forces in many different forms, in many different places, in many different ways, poses a particular challenge to what I believe are the essential elements of a liberal democracy. And whether it's in Myanmar, where a government has played the populist card in order to exclude an entire group of people from being able to be citizens, and has persisted in this marginalization of the Rohingya population to the point where Parliament has described it as a genocide, and so have many other observers and students of what has taken place. And you then have the phenomena of the growth of nationalism in Europe, in many different countries, in Poland and Hungary in particular, and of course that unique act of self-destruction which we call Brexit, which we're watching in almost open-mouthed horror as it unfolds before us in the British Parliament. To say nothing of what we've seen take place in Venezuela and what we are seeing take place in the United States from different perspectives, but in each case you can see clear threats to the rule of law and to the foundational principles of democracy. Now, I've had the chance to talk about this to a number of other groups, and when I do, there's sometimes a resistance to saying, well, how can you put what's happening in Myanmar and what's happening in other countries at the same level, and then how does it relate to what's going on in Canada? Well, I think how it relates to what's happening in Canada is that the issue that has, I think, been at the center of much of our political and legal discussion over the last 40 or 50 years has been the question of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in our country. And we need to understand that the status and the discrimination against Indigenous people, which has been documented fully in a number of reports and which is the subject of much ongoing political discussion and debate, that status is the product of majoritarian populism in Canada. It's not an accident. It's not a sort of one-off. It's very similar to what the impact of the combination of empire and real deep populism in the Canadian population directed at the interests of the majority versus the interests of others, particularly Aboriginal people. That issue has been a key element of our national angst and of our national debate over the last several years. So let me try to bring this together for you in a relatively coherent way in about half an hour, and then you can fire away on questions. Let me start with the emergence of the first experience, if you like, of globalization, which was essentially when I, growing up in school, we were taught about the age of exploration and, oh, by the way, the age of discovery. Of course, that is the time at which a number of countries in Europe decided that it was time for them to explore the world and to discover what was out there. And of course, the first boats came across with Columbus in 1492 and others all around the world. And one of the things that's noticeable is the language that is often used to describe what took place. I have a little book on my desk which I'm going through, which was written in the 1940s. It's called The Discovery of Canada. And it's the story of the arrival of these explorers, Cartier and Champlain and others. And the very description of it belies the reality, which is nobody discovered Canada, nobody discovered North America. It was always there. And most important, there were people there. And this fact has huge implications for who we are today and the situation in which we find ourselves. The notion that someone from another country would come to Newfoundland or Gaspé Peninsula or Quebec City and put a flag down and say, this is now ours, this is mine. When you think about it, it's completely preposterous. But nevertheless, it is the foundation of much of our thinking and also much of our legal system about, well, how is it that though the laws and the values and the systems of governance that came from Europe between the late 15th century and well into, right up to today, take precedence over every other legal system, every other cultural norm, every other reality of life. And we are learning more and more about the fact that the cultures and the people that lived here in the decades, centuries, millennia prior to 1492 had languages and laws and cultures and ways of life and governance and governments which are scarcely recognized and reflected in our legal systems today. I teach a course called Indigenous Law and Policy at the University of Toronto with some of my colleagues at OKT, and it was only in the sort of the second year of our teaching it that we really came to fundamental terms with the fact that we actually weren't teaching Indigenous law, we were actually teaching what Canadian law thinks about the Indigenous reality of Canada. And it's only now, thanks to Professor Burrows and so many others who are doing this foundational work, that we're beginning to realize that there were laws, there have been laws, there are systems and cultures and ways of thinking and ways of being that the explorers and others attempted to destroy, but that nevertheless have survived and are still in place and still exist. So the consequence of first contact was catastrophic. Catastrophic not simply because of the sense of superiority of the people that came, catastrophic not just because of the impacts of conquest, but catastrophic because of disease. And we're only just now beginning to realize how devastating the loss of population in fact was. In fact, there's some work that's now being done on trying to account for the increase, how the climate in Europe and in the globe became colder for 200 years. And one of the explanations is that there was a huge dramatic increase in the forest all over the Americas as a result of the destruction of the population. Now, whether this is true or not, I don't know, but it is certainly an interesting theory, and it's certainly an interesting comment on how great was the destruction of the population and what consequences did that have. So you had empires fighting for land and fighting for territory and fighting for control and engaging initially in a kind of relationship with the First Nations that's different than what was to follow, because it was based on a sense of saying, well, these people are here, they know the land, they know the territory, they are savages, but still we need to deal with them and we need to work with them to our mutual advantage. And so the first treaties that were signed in the 17th century and the 18th century were treaties that were essentially attempting to buy favor and buy connection and buy support for the battle with the other empire. And of course, as we know, 1759 happened, the Battle of Quebec. In 1763 happened, the Treaty of Paris, and we know that the British Empire won out. Initially, after 1763, there was a genuine effort on the part of the British, again, driven as much by self-interest as by any sense of overall obligation or stewardship, to say, well, let's treat with these nations, let's treat with them, let's work with them, and let's engage with them as equals. And so you have the beginning of treaties which are more fulsome and flow from the Royal Proclamation. And the Royal Proclamation basically said to all the settlers who were living in North America, don't deal with the First Nations, don't deal with Indigenous Aboriginal people on your own. If you're going to deal with them, you deal through the Crown. And the Crown is the agency that's going to provide the guidance and the protection that's required. But it didn't take very long after that period of time for things to change rather dramatically as we come well into the 19th century and then the 20th century. And the huge, enormous expansion and wave of migration, but also a wave of prejudice and a wave of superiority that took upon it a sense of, well, this is the science. And then we begin to understand the racism that is so deeply ingrained in our imperial history, just as much as it's ingrained in the history of imperialism throughout the world. And it's an imperialism that says, and it's a racism that says, white people are better than anybody else. We are ethnically superior to all the others, whether it's blacks in Africa or Asian people or people in the subcontinent of India. Wherever we go, we are better. We are genetically better. And when you mix this with the theories of Herbert Spencer and of Charles Darwin, and you kind of try to apply them together, you develop this theory of social Darwinism, which says, we're better because we're better because we're better. We have survived, we have struggled, we are the fittest, and we are the best, and others are inferior. It's important to understand how deeply ingrained and how widespread this view of scientific, quote, racism was in the world, and in particular in North America, in Canada, and in the United States. And we also know now that as a result of that, a couple of other things happen that are of great significance. I call it the evil trinity of the Victorian world. And in Canada, the evil trinity was this. Well, first of all, these people are never going to survive in the industrial world. This world is too complicated and too advanced, and it's not a world that they will ever understand. And so we need to understand and appreciate that they are going to die out. And it was absolutely an assumption of Victorian public policy in Canada that the First Nations would disappear. And that people would either die or they would assimilate, but there would be no separate Indian culture, Indigenous culture, Aboriginal culture. Based on that assumption, the government of Canada decided in its wisdom, as expressed by its Prime Minister, Sir John Macdonald, that the only way we can possibly help these people is by taking the kids away from their parents and putting the kids in schools where they can be taught and they can be treated in a way which might give them some kind of chance. But as Sir John A. Macdonald himself said, if we leave the children with their savage parents, they will become savages like their parents. But if we take them out and put them in school, we're giving them the opportunity to be like us. And so we have the residential school system. Important to remember, the residential school system was, first of all, not unique to Canada. They had them in the United States. They had them in Australia and New Zealand. But the premise behind the residential schools was that we will take the kids away permanently from their parents and from their culture. And as Stephen Harper said in his apology to the House of Commons in 2011, the objective was to take the Indian out of the child. Now, it would have been bad enough if that had been done for 10 years and people looked at this policy and said, man, is this ever inhumane? We're going into communities, we're taking people away from their parents, we're physically removing them and putting them in a school which is totally alien to them. They're not allowed to speak their language. This has been a terrible mistake. Let's fix this. But it wasn't an experiment which lasted for 10 years, or 15 or 20 or 25 or 30 or 35 or 40. It lasted for over 120 years. And so we need to understand the generational and intergenerational damage that was inflicted by a majority acting within the law as they saw it. They had the majority power to pass a law which would allow them to do it. And then they passed an Indian Act which defined who is and who is not an Indian, where can they go and where can't they go, and the premise was, we'll put you in little communities, little reserves, little sandboxes, and you can play in that. But if you leave, you no longer have status. So, again, you're moving assimilation through as quickly as you can, pretending that you say, well, you're going to have this status, but if you move away, you're no longer a status person. So we expect probably millions of people who've over time, over history, lost their status, lost their position lost their place. And the final step of the Trinity was, oh, and we'll sign treaties, the numbered treaties. And the numbered treaties all have the same common premise. And that is, in exchange for our taking care of you, in some sense, some way, the wording is different in each numbered treaty, the history of each numbered treaty is slightly different, but the common thread of each and every numbered treaty is that in exchange for whatever you think you're getting, you are giving up any claim to title to the land. You're giving it up, and you're giving it up forever, and it now belongs to the Crown. So think about the total marginalization that has been achieved by these three things. And think of the damage that has been done and that we are still living with today. Now, without getting into more and more of the historical story, just remember one thing as law students, and that is that Section 35 was the product of the majority Liberal government agreeing to put it in because of pressure from another political party and also from the First Nations, who objected to any repatriation of the Constitution without assurances about their future constitutional rights. And Mr. Pierre Trudeau, whose first venture into Indigenous policy was to introduce the white paper, which essentially said, let's forget about the past, let's wipe the slate clean, let's get rid of the Indian Act, let's get rid of any notion of treaty obligations, let's just move on, and we'll give money to the provinces, and the provinces will provide more schools for you and do all that has to be done. Let's clean this up. We're all Canadians, we're all equal, we're all the same, no differences. And then, of course, along came the Calder case, which law students in the room will know all about. The single most important case in Canadian law in relationship to Aboriginal people. The current battles, legal battles, start with Calder. Why? Because Calder basically said to the federal government, you might have title in British Columbia, or in Quebec, or in Northwest Territories, or in Yukon, but you've got to show that you've got it. Where'd you get it from? Where does it come from? Treaties were signed by some, but treaties were not signed by a great many. So if there were no treaties signed, where do you get your title from? So to bring it home, before I get to Myanmar, because the two things are very closely connected, I think we've made a mistake in not fully appreciating the fact, which certainly the Supreme Court has expressed very, very clearly in the constitutional reference, for example, that democracy is actually more complicated than just one person, one vote. Democracy is not just about people going and having an election and then the winner takes all. That's not really what democracy is. That's a misuse of the term of democracy. And the more you think about it, there's been a debate about what is democracy that goes back a long, long time in history. Is it just about the will of the majority, or is it also about the rule of law? Because if it's only about the will of the majority, then it isn't necessarily about the rule of law. It could be about the rule of laws, because the worst dictatorships have laws and rules. But how do we distinguish countries which say, well, we believe in the rule of law? And that fundamentally means that we don't believe that a majority can be concocted which can dissolve the rule of law. And what we did in 1980 and 1981 and 82, when Doug's father and I were in Parliament, what we did was we passed a patriation of the Constitution with a charter and with Section 35. And the foundational principle, therefore, of Canadian democracy is that the majority doesn't always rule. Well, we're a federation. There are many, many different ways in which we live in a complex society. And again, the Supreme Court decision in the constitutional in the referendum question, the referendum reference, was absolutely clear-cut on saying democracy is more complicated than you think. It involves the protection of rights and the protection of minorities. But the problem that we have today is that governments have consistently resisted the full and fulsome recognition of the rights of Indigenous people. And they do so because the Indigenous people are such a tiny minority in the general population. And so politically, governments say, well, we don't have to do this unless the court tells us to. So while we're very proud as a country of, look at all the progress we're making in terms of reconciliation, and look at all the progress, look at these great progressive court cases that have advanced theories of reconciliation and accommodation and a duty to consult. Isn't it great? Except, ask yourself the question, who is the defendant in all these cases? Who is the defendant in virtually every single one of these cases? The Crown. The Crown, because they're basically taking the political position as a government. We use the word Crown, you know, it's the government. And where it is so ironic to me is that it is the court which is pushing back on the Crown and protecting the minorities, and then the Crown grudgingly goes forward and says, well, we'll do this much, we'll do that much. But if you follow this history, and it goes, there's no party can claim that somehow they're completely different from others in this regard, either federally or provincially. It is always been the case that the Crown has resisted this full recognition of rights, and proceeding from rights to self-government, proceeding from rights to economic empowerment, proceeding from rights to genuinely being able to improve the condition of Indigenous people. So where does Myanmar fit in all this? Well, it's quite simple. Myanmar also, like Canada, has had an experience of empire. And I'm sorry I don't have a colorful map. I really should do that one day. But if you look at the map of Myanmar, the map of Burma, Myanmar, there's a big river that goes right down the middle. And like a lot of civilizations, big rivers are at the center of the growth of big, large agricultural civilizations which essentially succeed hunter-gatherer societies. And on either side of the Irrawaddy River, the Bamar kingdom grew to becoming the dominant kingdom in what we now call Myanmar. And at one point it grew even to the point where it extended over into the kingdom to the west, which was the kingdom of Arakan, and essentially became the dominant force. But all around the kingdom of the Bamar were hill tribes that were constantly and consistently at war with this government, with this empire. And then the British came. And when the British came, they, over a period of, I'm compressing several dozens of years, and eventually they took over the entire governance of India, governance of what is now Pakistan, what is now Bangladesh, and what is now Myanmar or Burma, and put them all under one single roof, the Indian Empire, which was controlled by the British. When they did that, there was, of course, freedom of movement in the whole of the subcontinent. So, as a result of that, and as a result of all the earlier movements of people and populations, the demographic situation inside Myanmar became more complex. Now if I go to Myanmar, if you go to Myanmar and you sit down and talk with a government official and you use the word Rohingya, they'll look at you and say, no, there are no Rohingya. There's no such thing as a Rohingya. And I, at one point, asked a scholar, as I was studying about this, because I felt I needed to do my homework in order to be able to understand the dynamics, I said, what is the basis of this rejection of the word? I understand, political debates, but, what is it with the word? And he said, well, it's very simple. The word Rohingya means I'm a person from Rakhine in the Rohingya dialect. And the whole point of the official narrative of the country is that this group of people are not native to this country. They are from somewhere else. So if they say to you, I'm from Rakhine, they say, no, you're not. Well, I've actually lived there for hundreds of years. Yeah, well, we don't really know when you came, or why you came, or how you came, but you're not really native to us. And of course, they're Muslim. And the majority of the country is Buddhist. And people are often shocked when they say, well, I thought Buddhism was about peace and reconciliation. And I said, if you infect any religion with a view about ethnic superiority and a view about nationalism and about the advantage of your nation over others and why your nation is better than others and why you're superior to others, once that infection takes hold, it's a terrible, terrible cocktail. I've seen it in Sri Lanka, and I've seen it again now in Myanmar. And it's not that there aren't strong views within Buddhism that say, no, we have to all get together, we have to all live together, and they reject the most virulent racism that has been expressed on Facebook and elsewhere, but it's still an issue as to how one moves forward to a pluralist world. And ever since Aung San, who's Aung San Suu Kyi's father, coined the slogan, Burma for the Burmese, he was actually sending two different messages. He was sending a message to the British saying, you're out, time for you to go. But he was also sending a message to everybody else who might not be Bamar, we're in charge, we're the majority. And that tension lies at the heart of the constitutional battles in Myanmar, the rise of the army, the whole emergence of how Aung San Suu Kyi herself spent all of that time under house arrest and is now engaging in part of the democratic process. But if the democratic process is inherently based on a kind of populism that looks to how do we reflect and respond to this sense of nationalism, then we know what happens. Human rights go out the window. A sense of saying, well, we have these people who've been here for a long, long time. We can all debate about how long they've been here for, but they've been here for a very long time, and we can't let them be stateless. We must allow them to remain citizens. The irony is that on the day of independence, the Rohingya were citizens. They were, because basically what they said in 1947, 1948, if you're here, you're here, and we will include you. But since then, there's been a steady marginalization and think of the parallels, certainly I do, with how we've seen the impact of marginalization in our own country and had to come to terms and come to grips with the importance of protecting human rights, minorities, and the importance of seeing the rule of law as something that goes beyond the instant will of the people. One of the reasons that I don't like referenda, I mean, I'll say it, I don't like them, is that they're based on an illusion that somehow something called the people makes a decision. And then that decision is made and the discussion is over. So you see in Brexit, Theresa May saying, let's get on with it, the people have voted and the people have decided. Well, what are the 48% of the people who didn't decide that? Are they not people? Are they somehow second class because they felt differently about what would happen? And so in our parliamentary system, we've developed an official opposition, we've developed, and I worry sometimes the way parliamentary debates are going, where, you know, the explicit premise of our democratic system is that we accept the rights, position, and status of those who are opposed to us. We don't consider them to be non-people. We don't consider them to be just irrelevant. We accept their position. But of course, as debate becomes more polarized, often you feel that, well, you know, nobody's respecting anybody at the moment in terms of the decline of just civil exchange and having a conversation that goes beyond, you know, people just insulting each other. But where I think we have to be clear in our own minds is that there is something in the idea of democracy itself which can take us in two directions, not just one direction. It can take us in two directions. It can take us in a direction towards what I would call populism or extreme nationalism. It can take us in a direction where we say, well, the leader knows what the will of the people is. And sometimes leaders will say, I understand what you want. I know what you want collectively. And it's also based on the illusion that somehow there's no pluralism. There's no difference. The people is like one thing. And that's really a very, very dangerous idea. Because once that takes hold, and we do it in the name of democracy, of the interests of the majority, we then throw out all of the other protections and all of the other checks and balances and things that we ascribe to the rule of law that provide us with protection. And so I think we're, in many places in the world, we're at a very critical moment. And we shouldn't think that this critical moment is far away from peaceful little Canada. No. We can see signs of that kind of thinking emerging in many different parts of the country. We can see it in the continuing challenge that First Nations have to get the respect and the movement towards genuine reconciliation and advancement that people are looking for. And we have the tendency on the part of governments to fall back and say, well, this is what the majority, this is only as far as the majority is going to let me go. So if you want me to go any further, somebody else is going to have to tell me. And that's the court or some other institution. So I say to all of you, and back at the law school, just to say, the rule of law is really important. And it's really foundational for our concept of democracy, which takes us in a different direction. Our concept of, or what I'm proposing as a concept of democracy says, look, it's based on pluralism. It's based on representation. It's based on a respect for minorities. It's based on a respect for human rights. It's based on other limitations of power which might exist, for example, as they do in a federation. And is it complicated? Yes. Is it difficult? Yes. Is it frustrating? Often. But my goodness, it's so much better than the risks and damage that can be done with this push towards a populist notion, a simplistic, majoritarian notion of what democracy is really all about. And I think it's perhaps my explanation for why going to Myanmar and trying to work on issues there and working in Canada at the same time, why they're actually connected and how they relate to each other. I hope you've enjoyed this interlude for lunch, and now I'm happy to answer any of your questions.